Okay, let's be honest for a second. Have you ever told a lie? I mean, we've all been there, right? A little white lie here, maybe something a bit bigger there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's definitely a universal human experience.
So today, we're going to dive into the WHY. Why do we lie? And how can we, maybe be a little more honest? We're basing this deep dive on a podcast episode called The Power of Truthfulness, Why We Lie, and How to Foster Honesty.
Sounds intriguing. I'm ready to get honest.
Right. So the podcast talks about these two main reasons we lie, and they actually make a lot of sense. The first is the fear of punishment.
Yeah, that one's pretty basic, right? It's kind of hardwired into us, especially when we're kids.
Exactly. Like if you break something valuable, you might lie to avoid getting in trouble.
Oh, for sure. Remember those days? Hiding the broken base. But it doesn't really go away as we get older.
No, it definitely doesn't. The fear just kind of morphs. Instead of fearing a scolding, we start fearing losing things like our jobs, relationships, that kind of thing.
It's like that fear is tied to our survival instincts, right? We're trying to protect ourselves, even if it means bending the truth a little bit.
It's true, though. Have you ever been in that situation at work where you know you should speak up about something, but...
But you hesitate.
Yeah. Because what if you get in trouble or, lose your job? It makes you think about how often fear drives our choices, even in subtle ways.
Yeah.
The podcast also made this really interesting point about how small lies, the white lies, can lead to bigger ones.
Yeah, like a slippery slope, right?
Exactly. We tell ourselves these little lies are harmless, but...
But they kind of normalize dishonesty. And then it becomes easier to justify bigger lies down the line.
Right. So it's not just about avoiding the big obvious lies. It's about being aware of those smaller choices we make that might chip away at our integrity over time.
It's a really important point. The podcast even brought up this fascinating concept from Buddhism, the idea of absolute truthfulness.
Oh, yeah, I remember that part. It really got me thinking. What's the deal with that?
So, in Buddhism, being truthful is like a core principle. And it's not just about the big stuff. They really emphasize honesty in all our interactions, even the seemingly small ones, because they believe any kind of dishonesty, no matter how small, can cause harm.
Wow. So it's not just about avoiding punishment. It's about recognizing the impact that even small lies can have on ourselves and others.
Exactly. It's about cultivating a genuine commitment to truthfulness in everything we do.
That's a pretty powerful way to look at it. It makes you think about all the ripple effects our words and actions can have.
Yeah.
So how do we move away from this culture of dishonesty that we've kind of created?
Yeah.
How do we create spaces where people feel safe, to be honest?
Well, I think it has to start with a sense of safety. We need to create environments where people don't feel punished for telling the truth.
Okay, that makes total sense. But how? How do we actually do that?
Well, the podcast had some really good advice on this. They talk about 3 key strategies: avoiding punishing honesty, modeling honesty ourselves, and encouraging open and honest conversations.
Okay, let's break those down. Starting with avoiding punishment. What does that look like? Especially when it comes to kids.
Okay, imagine this. A kid comes to you and says, "Hey, I broke a vase while I was playing." What's your first reaction?
To be honest, my first instinct might be to scold them, but
Right, that's natural. But instead of focusing on the broken vase, what if you focused on their honesty? You could say something like, "Thank you for telling me the truth. That was brave of you. Accidents happen."
ooh, I like that. It's about praising the honesty rather than jumping straight to punishment. Okay, what about modeling honesty?
Well, as we all know, kids are like sponges, right? They learn by watching us.
Totally.
So if we want to encourage honesty, we have to be honest ourselves, even when it's difficult.
Yeah, but that can be tough sometimes. What if you have to tell someone something they don't want to hear?
It can be really challenging. But think about the times when you've seen someone be brutally honest, even when it was hard for them. How did you feel about that person?
You know what? I usually respect them even more for it.
Exactly. It shows integrity and courage, and those are qualities we want to model for others.
Okay, so we've talked about avoiding punishment and being good examples. What about the third point? Fostering those open and honest conversations. How do we create spaces where people actually feel safe sharing their truth, especially when it's hard?
I think it really comes down to being a good listener, being empathetic, creating a space where someone feels like they can tell you anything without being judged.
That makes sense. But sometimes it's hard to know if someone's holding back. What could you say in that kind of situation?
Maybe something like, "Hey, I'm here for you. You can tell me anything." It's about making it clear that you're on their side, that you're not going to judge them.
It's about building that trust, right? Speaking of trust, the podcast also mentioned this really fascinating example from Buddhist monasteries and how they approach mistakes within their community.
Oh, yes, that's a really powerful illustration.
Can you tell me more about that?
So, in these monasteries, the monks practice confession. They regularly confess their mistakes and wrongdoings to each other. But the focus isn't on shame or blame.
So it's not about punishment.
No, it's about understanding, offering guidance, and supporting each other's growth.
Wow. That sounds like such a healthy way to approach accountability. It's like built-in support for honesty and growth. It makes you wonder, could we apply something like that in our families or workplaces?
Right. What if, instead of getting defensive when someone points out a mistake we made, we saw it as an opportunity for open dialogue and growth? How would that change our relationships? How would that change our workplaces?
Those are great questions. It definitely feels like a more compassionate and constructive approach. Okay, this is already making me think about my own relationship with honesty in a whole new way. But I'm curious, besides the whole moral aspect of it, are there actual benefits to living a more honest life? Like, what's in it for us?
Absolutely. And the podcast actually highlights 3 major rewards that are directly linked to our well-being and happiness.
You know, as we're diving into this whole honesty thing, it's really striking how much there is to uncover about it.
It really is, isn't it? It's like peeling back the layers of an onion. So many different aspects to consider.
Right. And before the break, you were talking about something that really piqued my interest, being mindful of our motives when it comes to honesty.
Oh, absolutely. That's a crucial piece of the puzzle. It's not enough to just speak the truth. We need to examine why we're speaking it.
So it's like, are we trying to manipulate or deceive, even subtly, or are we coming from a place of genuine integrity?
Exactly. It's about being honest with ourselves about our intentions. Are we trying to control the situation or the person we're talking to, or are we truly trying to communicate authentically?
And that kind of self-awareness can be pretty tough, right?
It can be incredibly challenging. It requires us to be radically honest with ourselves, which, let's face it, can be the hardest kind of honesty.
It's funny, isn't it? We often think about honesty in terms of what we say to other people, but maybe the most important relationship we have is with ourselves.
That's such a profound insight. If we're not honest with ourselves, how can we possibly be truly honest with anyone else? It's like building a house on a foundation of sand. It's just not going to hold up in the long run.
Okay, so how do we start building that foundation of self-honesty? Where do we even begin?
I think it begins with introspection, taking the time to really reflect on our thoughts, our feelings, and our motivations. Why do we do the things we do? What are we trying to avoid? What are we hoping to gain?
So things like journaling, meditation, maybe even therapy, those kinds of things.
Exactly. Those are all incredibly valuable tools for self-discovery. And as we become more aware of our own inner landscape, we can start to identify those patterns and beliefs that might be driving us to be dishonest, even with ourselves.
It's like shining a light into those dark corners of our minds, right? The stuff we usually try to avoid.
Precisely. And as we bring those things to light, we can start to feel them, to transform them.
So honesty isn't just about telling the truth. It's also about being truthful with ourselves, about who we are and why we do the things we do.
Beautifully put. And as we progress on that journey of self-discovery, we naturally become more attuned to the nuances of truthfulness in all areas of our lives. We start to recognize those subtle ways we might be distorting the truth, even if it's unintentional.
This is making so much sense. So let's say someone's listening to this and they're like, okay, I'm ready to be more honest, but where do I start? What are some practical steps they can take?
That's a great question. One powerful strategy is to start small. Focus on those everyday situations where you might be tempted to tell a little white lie or avoid a difficult conversation.
Okay, can you give me an example?
Sure. Instead of saying, I'm busy, when a friend asks to hang out, maybe you could be more honest and say, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed right now, but maybe we could get together next week. Or instead of just agreeing with someone to avoid conflict, you could respectfully express your own perspective, even if it's different.
I see what you mean. It's about being more mindful of those little moments where we compromise our honesty, even in subtle ways.
Exactly. And those small changes can have a ripple effect on our overall sense of integrity.
It's like strengthening a muscle. The more we practice honesty in those small moments, the easier it becomes to be truthful in those bigger, more challenging situations.
That's a great analogy. And just like any muscle, it takes time and effort to build it up. There will be setbacks, moments where we fall back into old habits, But the key is to be patient with ourselves and keep practicing.
It's about progress, not perfection.
Absolutely. And this reminds me of something we were talking about earlier, creating environments where honesty can thrive. It's not just about our individual choices, it's also about the systems and structures we create around us.
So, like, if we want to live in a society where honesty is truly valued, we need to create spaces where honesty is encouraged and supported.
Exactly. Think about it. If we want to live in a world where honesty is the norm, we have to start building it brick by brick, beginning with ourselves and then expanding outward.
But honestly, that feels kind of overwhelming. Like, where do we even begin to change those systems? They feel so big and entrenched.
It's true. Changing systems is a long-term process, but it's not impossible. And I think it starts with those individual acts of honesty, those moments where we choose to be truthful even when it's difficult. The more people who embrace honesty as a core value, the more we can influence those around us and inspire positive change.
It's like that saying, be the change you want to see in the world.
Exactly. And remember, even those seemingly small acts of honesty can create a ripple effect. So let's each commit to being a little bit more truthful today and see what kind of waves we can create.
I love that. It's about taking those little steps one at a time. But, as much as we've been talking about the benefits of honesty, I have to ask, what about the challenges? Because let's be real, being truthful isn't always easy or comfortable. Sometimes it can be downright scary.
You're absolutely right. It's important to acknowledge that there can be real cost to honesty. Sometimes telling the truth can lead to conflict, disappointment, or even loss. Those are real possibilities we have to consider.
Yeah. So the question is, are those costs worth paying?
That's a question each of us has to answer for ourselves. But I believe that in the long run, the benefits of living truthfully far outweigh the challenges. When we live in alignment with our values and we're honest with ourselves and others, it creates a foundation of trust and integrity that ultimately leads to a more fulfilling and meaningful life.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about those situations where honesty might hurt someone's feelings or damage a relationship? Like, how do we navigate those tricky waters? Is there a way to be truthful without being cruel?
That's a delicate balance for sure. There's no one-size-fits-all answer. But one guiding principle I try to follow is to always speak from a place of compassion and respect. Even if we have to deliver difficult news, we can do so with kindness and empathy.
It's not just about what we say, but how we say it, right? Our tone of voice, our body language, our choice of words, all of those things can make a difference.
Absolutely. And sometimes it might be appropriate to preface a difficult truth with something like, I'm sharing this with you because I care about you and our relationship. It's about letting the other person know that our honesty is coming from a place of love and concern, not a desire to hurt them.
I love that. It's like, even though the truth might be hard to hear, it's being delivered with a soft landing. So much to think about. But before we get too carried away, we're almost out of time for part 2. What can our listeners look forward to in the final part of our deep dive?
Well, we've come a long way in this deep dive into honesty.
We really have. It's amazing how much there is to say about such a, seemingly simple concept.
It is, isn't it? But before we wrap up, you mentioned some really interesting stuff at the end of the last part. Something about real-world examples of honesty creating positive change.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. And the connection between honesty and, like, spiritual growth.
Exactly. Those are the two big things I wanted to touch on. So first, let's talk about real-world examples.
Okay, let's do it. Do any specific people come to mind?
Well, when I think about honesty as a force for change, one person always comes to mind, Mahatma Gandhi. His whole philosophy of nonviolent resistance was so deeply rooted in honesty and integrity.
Oh, absolutely. It played a huge role in India gaining independence from British rule.
It really did, and it just goes to show the power of honesty, even when you're up against incredible oppression.
His commitment to truth was just, like, unshakable. So inspiring.
Totally. And we see similar examples in the civil rights movement here in the U.S.
Oh, for sure.
Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, they were all about speaking truth to power, no matter the cost.
Exposing injustice, demanding equality. It's amazing how honesty can be so disruptive,
Yeah.
in a good way.
Absolutely. It shakes things up. It challenges the status quo. And it's not just about these big historical movements. Honesty can be a catalyst for change in our everyday lives, too.
Okay, I'm curious. Tell me more about that.
Well, just imagine working in a company where honesty was truly valued.
Go on.
Like a place where you feel comfortable speaking up about problems, sharing your ideas, even admitting when you've made a mistake without being afraid of getting punished for it.
I mean, that sounds pretty ideal, like a
No.
total breath of fresh air.
Right. Think of the creativity and trust that could flourish.
Yeah, you'd have way more collaboration. And people would probably just enjoy coming to work more.
Exactly. So honesty isn't just a personal virtue, it's also vital for creating a healthier, more productive society. And that brings us to this other fascinating aspect we talked about, the link between honesty and spiritual growth.
Oh, yeah. I've always felt like there's a connection there, but I could never quite articulate it.
Well, a lot of spiritual traditions actually emphasize honesty as a core principle. Like in Buddhism, truthfulness is one of the essential moral guidelines.
So it's not just about being a good person, it's like a deeper thing.
Exactly. It's about moving toward the state of liberation from suffering. And in other traditions, honesty is often linked to the idea of purity of heart.
Interesting. So it's about living in accordance with our values, our truest selves.
Exactly. And when our inner world and outer world are in alignment like that, that's when we find a true sense of peace.
Wow, this whole conversation has been eye-opening.
Yeah.
From the psychology of lying to the power of honesty to change the world, and even this connection with spirituality. So much to consider.
I know, right? But before we sign off, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Okay, shoot.
We've talked a lot about why honesty is important, but how do we actually live it? How do we make this a part of our everyday lives?
I mean, yeah, that's the real question, isn't it?
It is. And honestly, there's no easy answer. It's a lifelong journey of self-discovery, of choosing to align our thoughts, words, and actions with truth.
It's not just about what we say, but how we show up in the world, how we make decisions, how we treat others.
Precisely. And some days will be harder than others.
Oh, absolutely. We're all human. We're going to mess up sometimes.
Of course. The key is to keep practicing, keep striving to be a little bit more honest every day.
It's about progress, not perfection, right?
Exactly. So let's all commit to making honesty a habit, starting today.
I'm in. Well, this has been an incredibly thought-provoking conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the power of truthfulness.
It's been a pleasure. And remember, the journey doesn't end here. Keep exploring, keep reflecting, and let the transformative power of truth guide you.